I'm focused on helping service organizations expand their reach, so a lot of different marketing challenges and opportunities. And prior to that, I had about 20 years of corporate marketing and strategy roles in a variety of marketing arenas. And so it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. And thank them all for sharing their expertise with us this morning. I appreciate it. And thank you to Overit for sponsoring this event and hosting us in your beautiful space. First, introducing Blaise Bryant. Blaise is the Communications and Outreach Associate at Consumer Directed Choices, an organization that works with seniors and people with disabilities who want to self-direct their home and personal care. Blaise is also on the board of the American Marketing Association chapter here in the Capital Region, and he deals with web accessibility issues on a daily basis as a user of assistive technology known as screen readers. Thank you, Blaise, for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Next, introducing Jennifer Monthi. Jennifer Monthi is the Legal Director for Disability Rights New York's statewide protection and advocacy system, investigating allegations of abuse and neglect and providing civil rights advocacy to people with disabilities. And Jennifer has over 15 years' experience as a legal advocate and educator within the disability rights community. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us.
Having me.
And last but not least, Daniel O'Leary, Senior Digital Strategist here at Overit Media. Dan has over a decade of experience with digital marketing and website development, working on a variety of digital strategies for his clients, including search engine optimization, content creation, digital analytics, and website accessibility. Thank you, Dan, for being here and pulling all this together. Okay, let's dive in. Our first question poses to all of our panelists here for the first question. What is accessibility and why does it matter?
Blaise, why don't you start?
Okay. Wasn't sure which way we wanted to go here.
Come down
the line? All right.
Yeah.
So you did. Okay, gotcha. Order of operations, that's an important thing. Accessibility, I don't mean to be literal here, is literally being able to use a website, being able to use assistive technology. It means having the ability to use single letter navigation when using a website, like H for heading, N for non-linked text. I don't know if any of you were at the breakfast brief yesterday when I talked about this. I'm sorry if you have to hear me go on and on and on about this again. But if you weren't, thanks. And it's also having proper labeling of buttons and checkboxes. You can't just say checkbox. I don't know what I'm clicking, especially if it's those wonderful terms and conditions boxes. And buttons, oftentimes with labeling, I see things where it's just button, 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 or unlabeled 0 button, unlabeled 1 button, unlabeled 2 button. Have a screen reader yell that stuff at you all the time. It really is frustrating because I don't know what I'm clicking on, and generally these things are embedded in some sort of a graphic. So accessibility literally to me is usability. I'm done.
Thanks, Blaise.
Sorry, I tried to shoot you the look, and the
I was not looking at you. I was not looking at you, so
I was trying to look at you.
So if it's my turn, so our organization is a legal organization. I'm an attorney, and when I think of accessibility, a lot of times my clients are coming to me, and I have to put on the frame of legal accessibility. So from that perspective, there are several federal laws, there are several state laws. If you operate out of the city, there's city laws that talk about what is accessibility for business owners and therefore and for users. And really what it comes down to fundamentally, if I were to peel back all those laws, is equal access. It is ensuring that when you're designing something that you're asking the public to come to, that everyone in that public can use it. And as your nice little one-page flyer shows, at the top, there's a did you know, there have been a onslaught of legal cases really exploring whether a law that was built, laws that were created sometimes even before the amount of online presence that we have by Congress, by state governments, by local governments, are now saying those laws really apply to the virtual world as well as the physical world. Because as our businesses expand to that virtual world, there are now questions about whether that world has the access it needs to allow people to benefit from it. And it really comes down from this one thing. If you are and I'm going to use a legal term, a place of public accommodation, meaning you are holding yourself out to the public, you have this responsibility not to discriminate against people with disabilities. And what we are finding through an onslaught, these are, think about these 15,000 lawsuits on one topic, which is website accessibility. That is astounding in the legal community. Even though you think lawyers sue all the time, that is a lot of lawsuits about this one topic. And I expect that that will double next year as well. So what the courts are grappling with right now is a law written primarily in the early 90s, some even before that, some in the 70s, and asking ourselves, how do we apply that law to an ever-changing dynamic of virtual development of businesses. What I can tell you is that accessibility is forcing businesses more and more to accommodate themselves to people who need to use websites that don't use it in the way that people without disabilities use the website. So what I will say, I'll leave with this concept. Visual accessibility for people with either visual impairment or who are blind is one thing, but when you think about accessibility, you also have to recognize that people have a variety of different disabilities. And so when you're designing it, you're not designing it for one monolith type population. And so accessibility changes depending on your user, depending on your customer. So it is not a box that you can click and say, I'm done. It is something that you have to constantly think about in the same way that you think about, how do I get the public to access my business every day? How do I increase my public's access to my business every day? This is the same thing. How do I continue to make my business accessible to all of my population?
Thank you. Accessibility from the perspective of a digital strategist, and from, if any of you are coming from an organization or a company or your own personal website, accessibility to you may mean it's essentially a design philosophy. It's a design and web development philosophy that emphasizes universal inclusive design. And I want to reiterate what Jennifer just said about abilities, that it's not like it's this or that. It's not an on and off switch. I like to use the term differing abilities because they really exist on a spectrum, and they can be permanent, they can be intermittent, and some can be temporary. Every year, millions of people turn 65 or older, which means that they have diminishing eyesight, right? So things like color contrast and your light to darkness ratios, these things really matter depending on which types of populations you're targeting. 15% of young men are colorblind, and there's up to 5 different types of color blindness that need to be checked for. You could have auditory issues where you cannot hear, so you cannot consume video content in the same way. It needs to be transcribed or closed captioned, right? It could be a physical disability where you lose the ability to maybe even temporarily use a mouse or a cursor. My son broke his right arm just a few months ago, and he had been raised on like using a specific way of interacting with his phone and his tablet, and then when he broke his arm, he really had a hard time using it, so I had to show him keyboard shortcuts and how to use voice prompts to use it, right? So now his arm is healed up, and we don't necessarily consider, well, he has accessibility needs, but these things, again, they exist on a wide range of spectrum. So we want to be appreciative of that. Like Jennifer said, this is not a checkbox. This is not a project that you like plan out and you complete and you go, check, we're done. Accessibility is an ongoing process, and it needs to be, I like to use the term baked in. It needs to be baked into your operation and your organization if you are committed to having a website in the year 2018 and moving forward. Every organization, if you're going to take accessibility seriously, needs stakeholders. Someone who's genuinely going to champion for this because it needs to be championed, and someone who's going to own it. Unfortunately, right now, most of the experts in this field tend to be legal experts, those who are impacted by it the most, or those like who are actually web developers. I'm not a web developer per se. I work very closely with them. I'm more of a strategist and content specialist, but those in the web development community are also at the forefront of this. But we need more stakeholders. We need organizational processes, and we need mechanisms for feedback, because again, you're never done with this. You may have an accessible website, you may have audited it, and you feel that you're in the clear, but as new technologies emerge, as new content types become popular, you want to make sure that you have a mechanism to receive feedback from users of your website that are specific to the notion of accessibility, and that you can recognize them, address them, and then remediate whatever needs to be done for your website, both for your users and frankly, like, it's a risk vector, right? No one takes cybersecurity as negotiable anymore. It's not negotiable. No one takes user or data privacy, especially in the wake of all the data issues that have been going on. That's my personal info. That's non-negotiable. 5, 6 years ago, do I really need a mobile website? Non-negotiable. In my opinion, website accessibility will become the new watermark of non-negotiable, particularly as we see an increase in lawsuits. And almost all of you are in New York State. I can tell you that when you look at what is the share of lawsuits and where are they coming from, they're coming from 3 primary states: New York, Florida, Texas, and California. 4. New York was by far the first, and it had almost 3 times as many lawsuits as the second state, Florida. So you are in the epicenter of where this legal movement is going.
Thanks, Dan. All right, let's start with Jennifer on the next one. What exactly does the ADA require from website owners?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the ADA, but I want people to realize, and I'm going to do this, I could spend 4 hours on what the ADA calls for. I'm going to do it in 5 minutes. So keep in mind that when I talk about the ADA, there are mirroring provisions within state law, which is the human rights law or city law, as well as in another federal law, which is the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation, or 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. So you have many laws that kind of exist, and when these lawsuits are brought, all of them are cited as a provision. The ADA protects qualified people with disabilities from discrimination. That's just the fundamentals of it. There are 3 titles to the ADA, Title 1, 2, and 3. Title 3 specifically deals with places of public accommodation. So those are the private businesses or places that the public is allowed to go or welcome to come. And what the Title 3 requires is that the business or the entity has to allow for full and equal enjoyment of the goods and services of that place of public accommodation. So this is where the courts have disagreed a little bit. What does it mean to have that full access, and what does it mean to be a place? What is a place of public accommodation? Is a website a place of public accommodation? In New York, which is under the Second Circuit, so in the federal courts we have district court level, and then we have circuit levels, and we are in the Second Circuit. And what's happening right now is the circuits across the country are kind of disagreeing about whether a business needs to make a website accessible if it is only in the virtual world, or if a business has to have a connection between the virtual world and the physical world in order to be covered by the ADA. In New York, or the Second Circuit believes there has to be some kind of connection between the virtual world and the physical world, the place of public accommodation, in order to have to be covered by Title 3 of the ADA. That decision occurred in 1999. We have since had a lot of other decisions, and if you really think about where we were in terms of web design in 1999 and how reliant we were on it from then until now, you can see why we are now getting some district court decisions, which a majority of cases are really handled at that level, which are sort of pushing back on that standard, or at least saying, I can't tell the difference between a virtual world business and a physical world business because so much of business is really handled in the virtual world. So if I were giving my free advice to you, I would say that it's probably going to be hard for many of you, if you're in the business world, to justify that there's no connection between your virtual presence and your actual storefront business. And businesses that are being really looked at right now, like Netflix, which nobody goes anywhere to get access to Netflix, right? They're on their devices, are still being held accountable under Title III. So if Netflix is being held accountable, if you've got a storefront and you're out there on your website asking to draw business to it, you probably are going to be held accountable too. The two cases I really want to draw your attention to in New York, and these are both from 2017, both essentially 2017. It's kind of the most up-to-date one in New York, is called the Andrews versus Blick Art Materials. And essentially this case was about an art supply store and an individual who couldn't access the website to purchase things through that art supply store. And what the decision in that case, the judge came through, is really walked through the history of why the ADA exists and why people need to have access to places of public accommodation. And I think even these judges are now getting into the technology and using words and that web designers are now using, which is frightening in and of itself. As a lawyer, the expertise that you really have to get into in order to litigate a case. But ultimately, the first step in every case is that when a plaintiff files a lawsuit, typically a defendant says, I would like you to dismiss this case. And you really just look at, did the plaintiff, if I accept everything true that they say, is there a violation of the law? And most of these cases are getting through that process. And just as a point of reference, that can take 2 years. Okay, so this is a long, drawn-out process to litigate a case. What happens after the plaintiff is successful, the person with a disability might be successful in such a lawsuit, is there's often a settlement. The parties look at it, you really look at the money you're going to spend trying to litigate the case versus fix a website, and you might say, let me just fix a website. And I'll tell you, I'll have you talk about the cost differential. There is a huge cost differential between litigating a case and actually just making a website accessible. But what ultimately is being decided in these cases is you have to make it accessible, and then what does that mean? What standard should we apply? And as the industry increases their standard, the court cases keep on adopting the next standard that comes out. They don't say you have to do it. They say you'll be okay if you do this one, which puts, I think, businesses in a really ambiguous position. And so that's really where we sit right now in New York, is some district court decisions that really lay out what a business probably should be doing to protect themselves under the ADA. And right now we are in court decisions that are, the WCAG 2.0 or 2, those are the decisions that are coming out right now.
Thank you. Accessibility for organizations is going to require fundamentally, I would say, 2 things. One is a comprehensive content type audit of your website. When members of the disabled community like Blaise use a screen reader, it generally does not have much difficulty with pure text content, all right? So those of you who have websites, the more text that's on it, the more you should be in a good position. But I want you to think about what types of multimedia assets are on your website. Even if you have, I just have a blog, you probably have images in it, right? We know kind of web design best practices, you need some imagery, you just can't have blocks of text. So even if you have a lot of text on your website, you're still not in the clear because there's going to be other assets that maybe you haven't really thought a lot about. So content types audits, do you have pictures? Do you have images and logos? Do you have tables, right? Because tables are a little bit harder to read than text, especially if there's rows and columns. Do you have multimedia like video? Do you have audio? All of these things have very specific ways, and there are a few different ways to accomplish this, but there are ways that will meet the obligations laid forth by the court and that will actually meet the needs of your users. So for each one of those types of barriers, whether it be visual, auditory, physical, there are means and mechanisms to make sure that there's always more than one way to perceive, okay? And on your kind of sheet here, 4 main principles of accessibility. I'm going to cover this a little bit later. One of the first one is perceivable. Content must be perceivable in more than one way and must be physically perceivable to the user in that they can actually use, right? So you've got to audit your types of content. The second thing you need to do is you need to have genuine user walkthroughs of what you're trying to accomplish on your website. The way most people kind of approach audits these days, it's not necessarily wrong, but I find it a little bit limiting, is they look at, is this page accessible, right? One URL at a time. When we're using a website, our experiences aren't like that though, right? We're not super cognizant of like, what page am I on right now? You click on a link, you go someplace, and then it has things you're looking for or things you can do, or you keep on clicking on things, right? So if you're trying to book a hotel, that's not on a specific page. If I'm trying to buy a ticket to something through a shopping cart, Blaise mentioned forms and checkboxes. Any interactive elements, right? Every website, there's a core purpose of what you're trying to get your users to do. You're trying to get them to give you your contact information, fill out a form, download an asset, purchase something, and add it to a cart. You need to have members of the disabled community walk through using the assistive technologies that they utilize to make sure that they can conduct the user tasks that are being done, okay? In the instance of images, I just want to give like a really specific and good example. This is low-hanging fruit for accessibility. Every image needs what's called alternate text, right? Alt text. Some websites, by the letter of the law, have alt text. I've audited these sites, and I look at them, and the alt text says, image2.png.
Ugh.
Thank you, right? Link text, you want to give something away, a download or a PDF. Click here. For what, right? So we need to be a little bit more proactive in thinking, all right, no token link texts anymore. Click here to receive, click here to download, X, Y, or Z, right? These are going to be more descriptive when a screen reader actually reads them out loud. If any of you are curious, there's a free screen reader software called JAWS, all right?
Actually, JAWS isn't free.
JAWS isn't free?
JAWS is not free. It actually costs about $1,000. The one that
Damn.
is free, sorry, Dan.
No, go, please.
Is called NVDA. It is a free download. I will tell you, I will warn you in advance right now, the voice might give you a headache. Actually, it'll probably give you a headache. I don't use NVDA. Why?
You don't want
Yeah, exactly. It gives me a headache. And the other, I don't know if you were in the middle of making a point.
No,
I'm
go, please.
sorry.
Yeah, no.
We're so prepared. Actually, no, we really. The thing is, don't just come to me for to determine whether a website is accessible. Say that 10 times fast when you haven't even had 2 cups of coffee. I can only focus on the screen reader and the browser and the way I do my web testing, because I have done it. I use a Mac computer. I also have a Windows computer. I use Safari, Google Chrome. Mac has VoiceOver. Actually, one of the beautiful things about Apple products is the fact that they have a built-in screen reader called VoiceOver on the Macs, the iPads, the iPhones. Truthfully, it's partially why they're more expensive, but no one will tell you that except for me. That's not to say that PCs or Android phones don't have that stuff built in. Android, I guess, has a pretty good screen reader built in called TalkBack. Windows, of course, has Windows Narrator. You could also use that instead of NVDA as an alternative. Windows Narrator is pretty good. It'll definitely give you an idea of whether your website is accessible or not. So,
to someone who uses a screen reader.
Right. Now people who are on the autism spectrum, they have color contrast things that I'm too blind to think about, to be quite honest with you.
Yep.
And there are groups, there are autistic groups in the area, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, that tends to be a good one. And I mean, they eat this stuff up. They love doing it because that is one of their biggest complaints is visual stimulation. I can't believe I'm talking about visual stimulation. I really can't. And it's just something that I can only imagine how difficult that's got to be. I mean, yeah, we have in common auditory stimulation, but certainly not visuals. That's just another thing to think about.
If any of you have on your homepage like slider carousels, the speed at which they move can impact members of the autistic community, right? So there's a certain speed at which they should move and not move, and it should always be able to be disabled. If there's any like audio that just auto plays during your homepage load, maybe it's like a background video that you have, HTML5 is becoming more and more popular, so you're seeing a lot of these kind of splash pages. That has to be able to be turned off, okay? So there's a lot of like cool new design trends, and that's kind of what happens, that we push out things without necessarily thinking about how it might impact someone who has sensitivities to too much stimuli, right? So I'm not advocating that everything needs to go back to like minimalism where it's just, Dan said just have only text, but you need to be appreciative when you use a multimedia asset and a new technology that you understand that your consumption of it is not universal. It's not monolithic, and that you need to be a little bit more appreciative of that. The last thing I would say is what does it require for you? Besides the auditing and the user walkthroughs, and ideally you're using assistive technologies to give you a strong sense of how they actually operate, you need a mechanism for getting feedback and constantly being able to improve the site. Some of the best sites out there that are doing this have an actual web page called Statement of Accessibility that sort of indicates, here's what we've done to date, here's the organizational stakeholders, and here's our general process for receiving feedback, and here's an actual contact form if you have any issues consuming content to let us know where and why and how you are having difficulties having that content, right? So besides, again, I want to reiterate, it's not a project that you just check off. It's an initial kind of audit, but then there needs to be a mechanism for feedback that can feed ongoing processes and inform stakeholders whose primary responsibility is to make sure that the website remains accessible.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine what it had to be like for, I don't know if any of you heard about this, it was pretty well known. There was a lawsuit filed by a man who is blind and an ADA attorney. This guy applied to over 50 colleges and sued over 50 universities because of lack of accessibility to their applications and whatnot. Could you imagine what that's got to be like to get that phone call? It's like, we're suing you because your website isn't accessible. I bet you a million times the reaction is, I didn't know. How could I make sure that's not the case? This is part of the reason why I'm here, to lend that hand, to be that person that looks at it that way, because at the end of the day, I look at where we are in society. We tend to be very reactive, not so proactive. And if I can help reverse that trend, let's do it.
Great points, you guys. When we think about ADA compliance and digital accessibility, Blaise, what do you think is the biggest misconception that folks should be aware of?
Okay, and then who am I giving a cue to?
Me.
Jennifer.
I'll
Okay.
look at you.
I will give you a better cue this time.
I'll turn this way.
So in terms of, what was the question again?
Biggest misconception in the space of ADA compliance, digital accessibility within that arena? What do you think is the biggest misconception out there that folks should be aware
got it.
of?
That just because it works with one screen reader means it's going to work for all screen readers. No, not one bit. I have seen plenty of instances where, depending on the website, I'll be doing something on my Mac or I'll be doing something on my Windows computer where it works for one and not the other. I've got another one as well. If you have image-based PDFs where the text is buried in the image, get rid of that, please, because I can't read it, and even if I run OCR, optical character recognition tools that are built into some of the screen readers, I know for a fact JAWS has it. I don't believe VoiceOver does at this point, but that only goes so far. It's not perfect. So I see this a lot with restaurant menus. And reading the menus, I mean, if I can't read your menu, I'm not going to go eat there. Sorry. I like to eat too much. You know, I'm guilty of being that impatient person. I guess it's not really so much impatience, but if you're not meeting my access needs, why should I pay you? Why should I give you the business? That's at least how I look at it. So I guess best practice is to either have a text-based menu, or even if you have, and you see this a lot with some of the chain restaurants, where the menu categories are linked. There's a link for your starters, or a tab. Starters, drinks, entree, salads, la-da-da. Those are very easy to read menus, all that stuff. And make sure your grammar and syntax is good on those as well, because it's funny how a typo can really throw things off if you use a screen reader. So I guess, you know, the misconception that just because it works for one, works for all, and just because you have a menu doesn't mean it's readable. Or just because there are all these different things that you really need to do. Jen?
Mm-hmm. See, that was my visual. That was my auditory cue.
Yeah,
there.
well, I figured I could do a better job at that one.
I would say, just briefly, misconceptions. The number one you should come out of here is designing for one person is designing for one person. But I think the other is that you should do this because not doing it violates the law. That's a misconception. You should do it because you have a consumer base that is untapped, that need to access your service, and they will. This is an arena that very few are really diving into, and I think they're going to need to in the next 10 years. Being the first there will give you a leg up for this community. They'll come back to you. They'll be users of whatever you're producing because you are meeting them halfway. And I think that developing those relationships, even if the initial feedback of it is, I met this 2.0 standard, just because you've met it doesn't mean it's accessible to everyone in the community. Know that. The response back shouldn't be, I met this standard. The response back is, well, how can I make this accessible for you? Many in this community really do rely upon the virtual world even more heavily than others, because they can be isolated in trying to navigate the world, whether it's from transportation problems to physical barriers as soon as they exit their home. So virtual worlds are really their place to be most free in some senses. So this community can be very well connected. They can get information out about your business very quickly and very loudly amongst their groups. So being known as an entity that's working with that community can have its advantages. So it's not just something that you comply with because you're afraid some lawyer's going to sue you. It's because you really could get traction within this community and it can expand your business.
Great point. Thanks, Jennifer. All right, let's start with Dan, and then we'll go down the line. I know we've already touched on some of the immediate next steps that organizations can take to improve accessibility, starting with content audits and other things, but final thoughts on that as we go.
Yeah. Immediate steps any organization could take. One is I would definitely direct you to the WCAG 2.1 standards, and whoever is in charge of your IT, your web development. I know many of you maybe have like kind of built your site yourself, or maybe you've outsourced it to a design firm. Get back in contact with the primary person who is responsible for actually kind of on really the technical standpoint, developing your website, and ask them, are you familiar with WCAG, and how familiar are you? There's 4 principles of accessibility. They're at the bottom. Again, perceivable. The content needs to be understandable as well. So again, like it reads a typo, that's not understandable. Link text that just says image to PNG, not understandable. People have cognitive difficulties as well. So Blaise mentioned kind of like having the menu headings, right, that you can quickly jump down. I want you to think about, even just from a content perspective, as you're writing, that you're not just creating large swaths of text that don't have headings or subheadings. So this is kind of going back to old school HTML tags, H1, H2, H3. These are tried and true mechanisms that were designed to help you organize your content. So I want you to think about how you're kind of organizing your content, particularly if it's like more than 300, 500 words. At that point, especially when you're listening to it, or you would maybe like to skip sections of the content, you're going to need organizational headings to let these assistive technologies and their users know, this is what I'm looking for. Operable, again, it needs to be usable beyond just a mouse. One quick way to test it is use your tab keys. Use tab to try to see if you can, with your keyboard, just navigate through the links, and then hitting enter actually click on links. If any of you are using JavaScript, sometimes the answer to that is no. It's not operable. Only on mouse click is it operable, all right? So this is something where, again, whoever kind of developed or wrote that script may need to go back and make some adjustments. So the first thing I would say is really familiarize whoever's the most technically astute person in your organization for the website to really become a little familiar with the WCAG standards. They're over 20 years old from the first one. The courts are looking to 2.0. We're actually on 2.1. So the courts having indicated 2.1 is the like standard. 2.0 and 2.1 are very close. There's 3 levels of conformity: A, AA, and AAA. Depending on what check or test or guideline they're testing for, A is the bare minimum level of conformity, and AAA is the highest level of conformity. AA, WC 2.0 or 2.1 tends to be, especially in the outcome of the Blick case, that seems to be the gold standard for if you design and develop to those standards, you're not only going to have as accessible of a site as you can have in this environment, but in the eyes of the courts, you're doing due diligence and good faith in trying to reach those. So I would say become really familiar with WCAG. And again, second thing is go back, and if you have not already done this, start an email trail in your organization that you attended this panel, that accessibility is a thing, that you know it's a thing, and that you're taking it seriously, and that you're going to come up with some sort of plan. Every organization's resources differ. I know not all of you have thousands of dollars to immediately just dump into web development to make a site that you were, well, I paid $500 to make it, I have to spend $5,000 to fix it. Everyone's timeline differs, but you need to show and indicate to communities and to the courts, God forbid that comes, that you've known about this, and one way to do it is to identify in your organizations who's the stakeholders, who's going to own this, and let's start documenting a paper trail a mile wide that you knew about this. That way there is no, we didn't know. Jennifer.
Yeah, the only thing I will add to that is the paper trail will only take you so far. The courts are like, you know, you spent 10 years on your paper trail. But I can tell you that one alternative that the courts are looking at to address an inaccessible website is whether a 24/7 staffed phone line would address it. Now, I think you could probably look at the cost ratio of a 24/7 staffed phone line versus a web design, and you probably wouldn't want to have a lawyer come to you and say, let's staff a 24/7 phone line while we figure out how to web design your website. So, but the larger companies, I'll give you an example. Domino's was one of the companies that has recently been finding themselves in the court setting, and that concept of, yeah, but we have a 24/7, telephone line. They didn't, but they thought they might do such a thing. And the court said, well, it's possible. It's possible that is an alternative to not being able to access the website. But that seems to me, particularly if you're not Domino's, that's a pretty high bar to try to meet as a business. The concern of we don't have enough money to do web design right now, but we're thinking about it, I don't know that it'll take you too far. It might delay people in the community saying, okay, when you're ready, let's talk about it, or I'd like to be a part of your, whatever, roundtable discussion on it, or how could you do it, or here, I'll give you this contact information so you can interact with my business. That'll take you a little bit further, but it won't get you all the way there. You really have to make meaningful steps to make change, especially when you get on someone's radar.
I still can't get out of my head how much it's got to suck to call Domino's and track your pizza.
Exactly.
Like that just sounds like something I'd have to do 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah. Who makes a telephone call anymore? Domino's.
I know, right? God forbid I can get my 18-year-old sister to, talk on a phone. Anyhow, I think in terms of next steps, be proactive. Have people who use this technology, who use screen readers, who use assistive technology, look at your website, because that's where your best feedback is going to come from. Then you can implement it. You have people right there that can assist. You set up a committee, set up a work group, and even if the work group consists of people who are not tech savvy, you need those people that can help you, because that is where you really get your best info. You guys said so much that I can't really add that much, which is great.
No, it's perfect. Do we have time for?
Yeah, I think we've got, it's 20 minutes to the end of the event, so I think we could do open Q&A.
Just as a reminder, guys, we are live streaming the event too, so I'll hand the microphone and you do questions so those online can hear you as well.
So I have a question. One of our vendors approached us last January, 2018, said this is coming, but it's really been focused on hospitality, hotels, restaurants, car dealerships. As a nonprofit, we try to run that we are at break even. So finally this year, our web host they did an audit, and it's quite honestly very expensive to bring our website up to, we're talking $10,000 to $20,000. $20,000 is probably for the AAA. What consideration or what has the government done to look at all the nonprofits that don't have the funds that maybe the Marriotts or the Domino's have to bring something into compliance?
I'll answer from a legal perspective. They're not treating a not-for-profit any different than a for-profit business. We had to, my organization is a not-for-profit organization, and we had to expend resources to get us to the point of making our site accessible. And I think that there is no, quote-unquote, kind of consideration for that. I think that there's some, there's some, just like, we need to fix this part of our building. We need to make sure that it's physically accessible to get into our building. We need to make sure that people from the public can access the building if you're putting a public service out there. Essentially, it's really burdensome on the not-for-profit, but it's a part of designing a plan for this is something that's going to have to happen, and this is the kind of next wave, whether there's grants for capital improvement that you try to go after as a not-for-profit, whether you look at what can be done and what can't be done. I think that the thing is, and this is what we learned in the web design kind of world, is that it's easier to build it from scratch than it is to make an existing site, accessible. It really is. So you're essentially paying the same amount for a brand new site versus the site. And if you didn't get great advice, maybe in the last 5 years, said, that's something that's going to be a while down the time, and you spent 5 years ago your $10,000 or your $20,000, you probably got some really bad advice. And I do think there's more companies that are in the field designing these things now than there were 5 years ago. What I will say to anybody that's thinking about this, really check your references on it. People are going to start holding themselves out there that they can do this for a lot less, that can do this. Yeah, sure, I can get you into compliance. Yeah, sure. You really do need to check who they've done, what the community says about what they've done, whether they're providing that ongoing technical assistance, particularly after your launch, because the things you learn after you launch that website in the first 6 months of launching your website will be eye-opening. I mean, you'll hold yourself out. We spent the $20,000, $10,000. We're good, and then all of a sudden you get an onslaught of like, your site is horrible. It's not accessible, and then you're making what in a kind of a web design are small tweaks, but to the community as a whole, it's like that was broken, that didn't work. So you have to do a kind of soft launch to a larger, launch, and you really have to, have some thick skin while you get those comments that come in about how horrible your site is. But no, they're not treating not-for-profits any different. I think that the community might give you a little bit more of a latitude, but they're not going to give you a pass, unfortunately.
I think it all goes back to having that policy on your website that says, look, we realize these are the issues, we're working on them. And Rome wasn't built in a day. Fixing a website, making it accessible, sure as heck isn't done in a day. If you have people with disabilities within your organization, have them look at your content management system, the CMS. At Consumer Directed Choices, we just recently launched our new website. And of course, I got to look at our content management system and see how well it plays, as well as the public website. And the reason why that's important is you have a sense of how everything plays. And because if it's not accessible within the CMS, chances are it's not accessible externally on the website.
My question is for startups, and also nonprofits would be included in this as well. So there are platforms like Wix and Squarespace that a lot of startups are starting with. I'm wondering, is there going to be a differential between the company themselves, and if they're putting out these kind of prepackaged, you can do this and this will be your website, if Squarespace and Wix will be put on the hook as far as the company putting the product out for accessibility, as well as the company, if they're selling a product saying this is a website that you can use, I'm thinking there may be shared responsibility.
Absolutely. I can tell you right now, WordPress is in ADA compliance. I don't believe Wix is. I'm not overly sure about what is it, Squarespace?
Squarespace.
Okay, I didn't tongue twist. Okay. Squarespace. WordPress is, I've used WordPress. It plays pretty nicely. So any startups, I would recommend going the WordPress route if you can.
I'll say legally, the courts are going to hold the business accountable, not the web designer. You are responsible for what's on your platform. Now, in terms of, there are some exceptions in terms of if you link to others and how much control you have over the content of another. So if you're linking to, let's say a video that's being hosted by someone else, if you have control over that content and you can make changes to it, then you're going to be held responsible for it. If you don't have control of it, then the entity that does have control is going to be responsible. But it's not going to be enough to say, I went to Squarespace and they said that this is accessible. It's your burden to figure out if that is true. My hope, because there are some really small startups that don't need to have an enormous web-based presence, is that there are some companies that get smart and say, here's your cookie cutter that can work and still be modified, and you can do add-ons that cost a little bit of money each year, but here's your start to that platform, and it doesn't cost you $20,000. Maybe it costs you $5,000 with 5 kind of each year going on. I, obviously from my tone, you can tell I don't web design, so I don't even know if that's, possible. But I think that is probably a next run of business, is to say, we are whatever, compliant with this. You can't do anything to it. You can't change it in a way that's going to make it inaccessible, but you can still add on as you kind of grow.
I'd be very, not skeptical, but just wary of using drag and drop website builders. They're very convenient, especially for those who are like, I'm a small business owner, I'm just trying to get a website up, and I'm not an expert at this, and I'm trying to teach my really different vein, like Wix advertises and sells themselves on their SEO. Wix's SEO sucks. Okay, they kind of embarrassed themselves during the Super Bowl, where the entire SEO community called them out because people like myself have to, like, on a daily basis, deal with the limitations of things that they're selling as like, set it and forget it, we got it covered, you'll be on top of Google. Considering they've already sort of offered these like offerings and they're already not delivering on them, I don't know whether they'll be held, from a legal indemnification standpoint, but I can tell you my advice would be that, it's a good start, but you should probably as quickly as possible move off of Wix or Squarespace. These are very boxed-in proprietary CMSs. They're drag and drop, but WordPress has drag and drop as well. It's free and open source, it's community-driven, and there are community-driven plugins even made by members of the accessibility community that you can use, all right? So you're not sort of boxed in with, well, Wix don't let me do it, and their customer service stinks, and every time I want to do something different, well, that's an upgrade fee. And that's really where Wix and Squarespace kind of like monetize, because their bare offerings are bare offerings. Anything that you really want to do that's a 2018 design kind of standard requires a costly upgrade, right? So you may save yourself a little bit of time on that first day using Squarespace, because you can have a domain up in 10 bucks, 10 minutes, but it would behoove you to find a real web developer, someone who feels comfortable again with WCAG standards or is becoming more and more versed in them, and that you're not sort of boxed in with a proprietary content management system that you can't see and you can't control and you can't modify.
Great points. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to try to sneak in 2 questions. So first question, I come from a fairly large organization that is in a highly regulated space, so everything that comes out of marketing communications is pretty much reviewed by legal, whether we like it or not. So in an organization like that, how would you recommend operationalizing a change to the web, knowing that there's, even in something like an alt tag, might be approvals about the type of language? So what would a structure look like in order to operationalize that in a medium to large size business? And the second question that I'll tag on from a legal perspective is, have you seen cases where the scope has included portal environments or apps or things that are not traditional web?
Can I answer? I'm going to answer the first one first. There are more and more cases about kiosks, about point-of-sale devices. All of those things are going to be covered under the same thing as a web-based platform. So yes, it's great that you have your iPad sitting out there that you're going to have somebody, I guess, use at a kiosk. You're still, the same rule applies under Title III of the ADA.
There's a type of markup called ARIA, area, web area, it's sometimes referred to. This can be used within websites, traditional websites, but it has been designed and developed for the notion of apps. It stands for like rich interactive applications. So anything that's considered a rich application, that could be an app, that could be a point of sale kiosk, anything that sort of is a connection between the virtual world and the real world can be considered a rich application. And they have the WCAG standards comply, whether it's a website or whether it's an app. Any sort of mediated experience is required to be accessible, and there are means and mechanisms to make them accessible. So there really is no In the end mind of a user, there's no difference between an app and a website. If you have an app, you're offering it because it's a more streamlined version of your website. It's pulling from servers in the same way. You may not have a URL window. That doesn't really matter. Even Google search results can index right to specific parts of apps. They're actually indexing parts of the apps. So the notion of, well, this is a website and this is an app, the barriers are breaking down anyway. So there are ARIA standards or labels are the ones that you can use that sort of tie much closer to rich applications.
And so I'll answer your first question, which is when you're in a larger infrastructure and you have all of these controls about what you put out publicly. I work in a law office. We have lots of lawyers in our office. So our executive director is a lawyer, which means that anything we put out is really going through 7 phases of lawyers in order to get it out. So I appreciate your concern. What I would say is that you need to have a trusted team that's going to be making decisions and put that in place. I would say that if it does go through something, quote, legal department, they should be really aware of the legal risk that your entity is under when you don't make these changes, and that should move your legal department to start advocating for some type of streamlined process of trust, meaning here's my web designer, this has got to get out, we need to prioritize these changes, so that's got to come through faster because we're at a greater liability risk here than we are over here with some memo that we might need to get out or some process internally. I also, you all, if you are a part of business, you are also employers, and there are rules that apply to your employees under the ADA as well. That's Title I didn't talk about. So having your employees be able to use your systems and having them accessible is also something that's put upon you as well. So if you have your employees that are most of us are at a screen the entire day, and if they can't interface with whatever you've done through your website or through your content, there's also risk there as well. So I think more and more, and I think you probably only have to bring this flyer back to your legal department, which says that like 15,000 lawsuits have been filed in New York alone in the last year. They might perk up a little bit and start some processes. I know we had other questions.
Is there time for one more?
Yeah, take
Okay.
one more.
Last question?
So we've actually been sued, and our reaction was exactly, wow, we had no idea. So we've been working towards making our site compliant. So kind of 2 questions. One being, is there something we can put on our site to protect us while we're going through this process to say, we are working to resolve this, because we have not actually implemented any changes as of yet, but we are working toward it. But as you know, sometimes building a new site or making changes to an existing site takes time. And second, as we were researching this with our developers, they had recommended a company called Site Improve. And Dan, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them.
Very familiar with Site Improve.
And so I'm just curious if you recommend them or another company like that, because again, it's very expensive to maintain it. They quoted us at $13,000 a year to maintain ADA compliance.
Site Improve is a largely software-driven company. I think when you're talking about like the checks that you need to run, I will tell you that you will always need manual reviewers. The automated checks in software at best can cover maybe 30, maybe 40% of issues. So Site Improve is fundamentally, their core service offering is a software check. Now, if you run their software scan and your website comes back with red flags all across the board, then you kind of know where you're at. But if you got green check marks from a site like Site Improve, you may not be accessible because they're only checking 40%. And again, they tend to check it by crawling a website and doing it page by page. Is this page accessible? They're not doing what I mentioned before, which is like user walkthroughs, where you're doing a journey on your website. So Site Improve, if you want a site or that's a kind of quick software driven, you're not really hiring a consultant, you're not buying a report, Site Improve is one offering. Another website or business I would recommend is called Deque, D-E-Q-U-E. They offer software, they offer complete comprehensive audits and remediation efforts, and they also offer a university. I'm actually sort of enrolled in their comprehensive like certificate program right now so that I can become more knowledgeable about this myself. So Deque, I think, is one place you could go to that if You know, you want someone who's just sort of like, these guys are complete experts in it. They've been doing it for 20 years. Someone that you can sort of say, start from scratch, give me a report and audit that I can give my developers. They have fairly turnkey offerings. I will tell you that, Jennifer said, kick your tires on vendors, because in these general areas where there's like watershed moments, and I've seen it with, we can make your website HTTPS, we can make your website mobile friendly, we can make your website be ABC. There's always bad actors who come out of the woodwork that really don't know what they're talking about, or who don't have quite the expertise that they're looking for. Site Improve and DayQ, I personally can vouch for, and I've taken many vendor calls, and those are the two that I think, from a just purely software and from a purely consultant standpoint, are the two that shine out. But you know, if you type in website accessibility audits or vendors, generally who's ever serving up Google ads, if they're paying Google ads, they're probably a fairly reputable vendor. But again, I'd always get a recommendation. I'd always call someone who actually worked with them. And if they won't give you a recommendation, if they claim, oh, non-disclosure agreements, move on. You need a vouch. Someone's like, no, these guys know what they're doing, and they did a good job.
And I would say also know who's in your backyard, because then you can have a face-to-face contact with whoever business is there. It's also who's serving your local community as well. In terms of, you had a question about like, what do I put on my website? I'm gonna give you the standard lawyer response to that. You have a lawyer now. You need to talk to your lawyer in terms of what you put out there. I would follow, after you've sued, you follow the legal advice. I don't know whether it makes a difference after you've sued, and it really depends on whether it's a class. So that's about what you're going to get hit with. One person sues on behalf of everybody else. It will probably prevent others from suing without consolidating the cases. So you may have gotten to the worst case scenario already, and putting it out there that we're trying may impact your negotiation for settlement. So I wouldn't. Oh, good. So I think that, yeah, it really depends on that. That's a marketing issue, like restoring your name. And how much you want to kind of put it out there that you're taking accountability for it. And I would say that's a kind of your name recognition versus a legal issue at that point.
A website accessibility statement should be, if you have one, if you're thinking about creating one, it should be visible in your footer and header links, sort of just like the About Us. It should be kind of like a global navigation element that you can get from every page. And again, it should state sort of that you know what it is, what your philosophy is about accepting feedback and mechanisms. And in the case of yours, if you're being sued already, it takes time, being transparent. What is the timeline? What is the expected timeline? Because again, I think members of nonprofits, members of the disabled community, the courts, it's a difficult situation we're all in, and no one is providing the funds. I mean, this is sort of one of these classic unfunded mandates, right? Like, how I have to do it, but I don't have the funds to do this. I think being transparent with, based on our situation, here's a realistic timeline for remediation and different levels of stages, and for each stage having, again, a mechanism for feedback by which members can participate in this process and give timely feedback that you take seriously and genuinely and bring back to the stakeholders and the developers, so that it's not just, well, we put up an accessibility statement that, like, we care, this matters, but we have no other further obligations in that regard.
And I'll put why you're not getting sympathy from the courts, because the law was passed in 1990. So, I mean, that's probably why you're not getting the, you know, as we move to this virtual world, we did not, and I'll put a we on that, because we recently developed, we did not move with it. We did not recognize our obligations as we ran to this world and said, here's the cheapest alternative to putting ourselves out there in that platform. And so that we're developing standards now with a law that predated the development of most of this is the reality of why people with disabilities run to the courts, is because the private market does not respond to their needs immediately. They're forced to respond to their needs. So that's my 2 cents for why you're probably not going to get a heck of a lot of sympathy from the courts after you're sued, because they're going to look like you've known about this for 30 years, like, even though you've only known about this since you've been sued.
I'll just close by saying that as a user of assistive technology, I think it's very important for that transparency, because I could be frustrated as all hell trying to navigate a website. But if you have something that says, we know this needs work, I greatly appreciate the honesty. But that's just me. I know other people feel differently about that, but I'm just giving you how I appreciate that. Honesty is the best policy.
Nice note to close on. Thank you all so much. Really
Thank
great
you.
discussion.
I can't speak for every panelist, but if anyone does want to stick around, I will be available for like one-on-one Q&As. I know a lot of you did not get to ask questions, so if there's any remaining questions, please stick around. We still have lots of fruit, lots of pastries, lots of coffee. I don't have anywhere to be till 10 o'clock or a little bit afterwards, so I can't speak for other panelists, but I really want to thank you guys for all coming out. And please, when you go back to your companies or organizations, talk about this, and again, let people know that today is Global Accessibility Awareness Day. If you have any social media channels, just please spread the word, because I think beyond, you guys are here, you get it, but there's a lot still out there in the communities and your colleagues and other people in your spaces, verticals that you're working in that also equally need to take this seriously. So thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.